thanks to all of you. Jokes aside about braving this and the hot seat and everything else, I'm always mindful, and it's 7 or 8 years we've been doing this, that Asia is a giant place and prognosticating is a really tricky business. But that said, there's a way we've started for the last several years, and we don't over-prepare this, but in this sense we have, to prompt a very fundamental pair of questions for each of the panelists, and I think it's the way we'll start again this year. And that is, as you look at that giant swath of territory that we're here to talk about tonight and the year to come, what is a particular thing that gives you a good deal of anxiety or may particularly keep you up at night? And on the other side, what is something in the same arena that may give you some hope? And why don't we just take it down in the seating order here? Somini, great to have you back at the Asia Society. Something that has you nervous, something that has you hopeful?
The thing that has me worried is also the thing that I write about, predictably. We are entering, and that is how the world is going to deal with climate change. 2020 is a really crucial year. And the reason I worry is, pretty basic things that you all are familiar with, probably. We are ending what looks to be the hottest decade on record. The permafrost is beginning to thaw. That is quite risky because if that melts, a whole lot of methane can be released into the atmosphere, worsening the global warming that we already have. And that's what climate scientists often refer to as the climate feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And so any sign of that kind of feedback loop is especially worrying. It has ramifications for all kinds of things, including the future of some of the world's greatest cities that are on the coast, with the seas warming faster than scientists had expected, and levels of sea rise that are projected. A lot of really, iconic cities in Asia, of course, are at risk. 2020 is a really, really important year, and we can get to some of that later. What gives me hope is the surge of kind of civil society activism, not only on climate action, particularly from children and teenagers on climate action, but also the surge of civil society activism that we are seeing really in some key countries in Asia. I am quite surprised by the sustained protests in Hong Kong. I am surprised by the level of national protests by young people again in India. So, that sense of engagement by particularly young people gives me some hope.
Thank you. A lot more to delve into, but let's go down the line with the initial question. Ravi?
Sure. So one of the things that I worry the most about in 2020 is the state of the global economy, and specifically what that means for Asia. The IMF has said that the world is in a synchronized slowdown. It is very clear that Asian economies, which really need growth for all of their objectives to come to fruition, be they job creation, be they keeping its young, vibrant populations healthy and happy and hopeful, be it delivering on the infrastructural promises that so many of its leaders have made to come to power. All of those things, I think, will falter if the economy continues to slow down in what, in South Asia, for example, until recently was the world's fastest growing region. India now, most worryingly, is in a dramatic slowdown. Its growth rate in the last quarter was 4.5%, which is down from 9.3% just in 2016. So that's a real slowdown, and the ramifications from that could be far-reaching and very worrying. So that's something that I worry about. On the flip side of that, the thing that I'm hopeful for, like Shamini, is this mood of global engagement and protest, not only on the climate, but also on a range of other issues. And this is truly global. I mean, in Latin America, you have Chile and Colombia and Ecuador and Bolivia. In the Middle East, you have Iran and Iraq and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia. In Asia, you have Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Hong Kong. These are very widespread protests, and it's hard to link them all together, but it's clear that for a new generation of young people, something's in the air for the first time in a global way since 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think there's a wider disillusionment with the way democracy has worked out, the way capitalism has worked out for them, with climate change, all of these things together. So who knows how it's going to play out, but it is very heartening to see young people especially come out and have their voices heard in a largely peaceful manner.
Thank you. Now, I hope you don't mind my sharing this, Nick, but I did say we prepared a little bit for this portion of this, and I worry a little bit about Nick Consonery because his list of things that keep him up at night is so long. As somebody said, we don't know whether you're sleeping very well.
That's right, but so I am a political risk analyst, right? So that's where I focus. Where we focus.
You want to pick one, or maybe
sure.
If you want two?
No, I think the big story for me, Asia 2020, is similar to what it was in 2019, which is U.S.-China relations. I'm still just very concerned about the trajectory of the relationship. I think, we've got a situation where the two sides have basically fought to a standstill over trade, and, clear at this point we're going to have some kind of phase one agreement that probably forestalls the chance for further trade and tariff escalation through the course of next year, though I think even there's some uncertainties, and we can talk more about that. But then, I think the next phase of tensions that you fight to a standstill over trade, and then we're entering this kind of new phase of tensions in the relationship that I think are going to be characterized much more by ideology and values, national security and technology. Right? This trend line of negativity and of decoupling in the U.S.-China relationship, I think, is going to be extended, not stalled, not reversed in 2020, and that's going to have huge effects for all these other stories we're talking about, from climate change to the outlook for growth in the region and everything else. So, and I also think that in an election year, there's this sense, and it's certainly a sense in the markets today, that are looking relatively positively on the outlook for 2020 because we think we've got a détente in the U.S.-China relationship. I think the concern is that Trump sees incentive ahead of the election to escalate even further in many other ways when it comes to China policy, as he did because it was such an important part of his campaign in 2016. So I'm very concerned about the outlook there. And in terms of an area where maybe a little more optimistic, and also from a political risk analysis perspective, I guess, but one country we've been very optimistic about is Vietnam. Where we see not only is Vietnam poised to, and has been benefiting tremendously from the relocation of manufacturing out of China because of trade war with the United States, but then also the political trend lines are reasonably positive, right? You've got a window for reforms to move forward in areas like foreign investment and labor policy that we think is open through 2020 and ahead of the Communist Party's next Congress in 2021. So that's an area where a little more
that helps you sleep better, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. By the way, and another thing I do just to prepare is have a look at what was said and prognosticated a year ago, and just on this particular line of anxiety-producing things, actually on the hopeful notes, not to obviously we hope that your hopes come true more than these did, but a year ago on this stage, when asked the same question, there was great hope for this window of diplomacy between the United States and North Korea. There was hope that there would be no further U.S.-China tariffs. And there was hope that Narendra Modi and the BJP in India would suffer enough of a setback in the elections so that he would be a chastened leader in 2019. And I think it's safe to say 0 for 3 on those. Anyway. Yeah. Now, so you've all mentioned here, and then just when we were talking before, this whether it's connected or not, Ravi, as you said, this surge of populism, protests, activism, depending on your word, and it's not just an Asia phenomenon. But I thought maybe rather than reflexively do what we do at this moment, which is dive right into China, because that just always seems to be the default place to start for all the reasons you articulated, Nick. Maybe let's just dive a little bit into a few of the areas where that kind of activism and protest was particularly powerful in 2019, and starting with Hong Kong. Now, that was, I think, fair to say, hardly discussed, at least not in that sense, a year ago. Probably, you could say, the biggest thing that happened in Asia in terms of unforeseen stuff in 2019. Where do you all see that going? Is it an example, Nick, of another negative U.S.-China thing? Do any of you see a roadmap for some resolution that is not particularly apparent right now? Whoever wants to start, go.
I think the best we can hope for is a stalemate. I was covering Hong Kong in 2014, 2015 during the umbrella movement, and it was clear then, and I think it's clear now, that some of the structural trend lines between what Beijing wants to accomplish with the government in Hong Kong and what the particularly youth population within the city expects for their future is headed to a fundamental impasse. And you couple on top of that the widening socioeconomic disparities, the ballooning cost of living, the real estate prices, and now, as Ravi mentioned, a concern throughout the region, but particularly a concern in Hong Kong. Right? I think the IMF forecast for growth in Hong Kong next year is like negative 2.6%. Mm-hmm. So you couple, layer on top of that a bleak economic outlook as well, and I just don't think any of those structural trend lines are going to improve anytime soon. So that's, the stalemate scenario is that you get enough, and it would have to be more than we've seen from the city government so far, but enough concessions, that they meaningfully take the wind out of sails of the protest movement in the short term. But I think that would really be a short-term solution, and unless we start to have more serious conversations about longer-term, types of political reform that might be on the table, it's hard to be optimistic.
For a while, didn't it look as if the concerns about the economy and a lot of Hong Kongers seem to think, okay, I might have supported this, but, well, number one, they don't support the violence of the few among the protests necessarily, and also, look what's happening to our city as a result, and that seemed like it might lead to a bit of a fizzle, but it's come roaring right back. I mean,
it's quite surprising that this has gone on as long as it has, and I say this because, if you look at the initial spark, which was the extradition law, and it's so easy to forget sparks in all of these global protests because it moves on so quickly from that. But that proposal was rolled back, and it didn't stop the protesters at all. And then they had more demands. And I think if you look at it from China's perspective, it's absolutely unacceptable for them to give in. Sure. And assuming then that they won't give in, it's hard to really see a good ending of any sort for Hong Kong out of this. So, I worry immensely about where this goes in 2020, and I do think the best we can hope for is a stalemate, and that it fizzles out the way the umbrella movement did.
Hard to say for me what happens in 2020, but one thing that I would watch in 2020 is the role of the internet.
In Hong Kong, you mean?
In each of these places, the role of the internet in how governments respond, what kinds of laws they try to bring in to restrict communication on the internet. We had a story, the New York Times had an incredible story today about how many times India has restricted internet use this year, and it is by far, more times than any other country by far.
Combined.
Paragon of democracy. It's interesting.
So how governments respond, how the spread of disinformation is dealt with on the internet, how the big tech platforms deal with that, how Facebook deals with that, how WhatsApp owned by Facebook deals with that. A lot of this is going to play out in Asia because these are the frontier markets, right, for the big tech platforms, and just, so many users and information and disinformation spreads so fast. So I would really watch the internet very, very closely in 2020.
Just one more beat on Hong Kong, and I don't know if any of you want to weigh in on this, but so Carrie Lam has been, it seems clearly unpopular in Hong Kong, but by some suggestions and some reports, not very popular in Beijing either. And so much is made of, will she go? How would that work? I do have to share, and I'm not sure this is quite a prediction, and I certainly can't tell you where it came from because it was on the sidelines of a China conference that we, just as a private conversation, and there was this discussion about, well, okay, so who, if she goes, and the perceived wisdom is, well, there isn't anybody, and you'd need somebody, of stature, and this then got to a conversation about Jack Ma writing in to come in and be the chief executive in Hong Kong. Any thoughts on whether forget that or don't forget that? I mean, I don't know if you think anything about that, but is Carrie Lam going to be in this position a year from now?
I'll go no. I would say unlikely to be. I think there's a precedent for chief executive to resign. It's happened in the past.
Yep.
I think Beijing has clearly been concerned about the precedent setting of having resignation of the chief executive be seen as an immediate reaction to the protests. But as this unfolds over the course of next year, I would say it's completely within the realm of the possible, if not probable. And if I could make one more point on Hong Kong, is I know, Tom, you didn't want to make this all about China,
That's right.
the greater China story, right?
We have events here that aren't even about China, and it becomes all about China anyway, so,
But the thing I should have mentioned at the beginning is, I think the spillover of the Hong Kong story into Taiwan, where we have this presidential election coming up in just a few weeks, right, where I'll go on the record and say I think Tsai Ing-wen's quite likely to get reelected there as well, and I think that's going to be seen as, within policy conversations in Beijing as a real blow to the goals and the legacy of Xi, who has been very explicit in talking about wanting to move the reunification story forward.
And I gather she's gotten a bounce quite directly because people there see what's going on in Hong Kong, feel she'd be a bulwark against that sort of thing, right? Okay. Anybody else on Hong Kong, or shall we move on?
Just a final beat on that. Let's not forget that Carrie Lam is a useful straw man or straw woman in this case, because she shields Beijing from some criticism. She can be the fall guy, as it were, and were they to replace her with someone else, they then take on more responsibility for that decision. So I'm not so sure she's out the door that quickly.
Yeah. Although a fall guy or a fall woman at some point has to fall, right?
True,
yeah.
true.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we move to India then? And you've made the point that this has gone on in Hong Kong for much longer than we thought. India, of course, this has really just happened. First of all, I wonder if one of you might be able to explain what has happened, because it's a little, I don't think it's quite fair to say that they enacted a law that, to discriminate against Muslims, but that's being the way it's being perceived. Do I have that right? And,
That's right.
Go for it.
Yeah, to take a quick stab at that. So the Citizenship Amendment Law Act, which was a bill until it was passed by both houses of Parliament, which are now dominated by the BJP. After it became an act, it was signed into law by the president. What this act says is that if you are a so-called persecuted minority in any of Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan, and these minorities could be Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and Zoroastrians. If you are any one of these six in these three countries and you moved to India before, I think, 2015, you can be fast-tracked to Indian citizenship. Who did they miss out? Muslims. Now, this in and of itself is not the biggest part of the problem. If you combine the Citizenship Amendment Act with another thing that happened a few months ago in September, this was the NCR, the National Citizens Register, in the state of Assam, in which Assam's 33 million people were asked to prove that they were Indian citizens. So they had to prove documentation that showed that they belonged in this country. As you all know, India is a very poor country where not everyone may have this kind of paperwork. So there was a big rush for everyone to get their paperwork. 2 million people, about 1.9 million people, it turned out, did not have the right documentation, and they were put on this list of, very uncertain list where their status is unclear. It turned out of this 1.9 million, many were Hindu as well. Now, this is where it gets interesting. If this NCR is enacted nationally, which is on the BJP's campaign manifesto, and you have a law in place which then allows Hindus to naturalize very quickly in a fast-tracked way, they will then be beneficiaries of this other act. Muslims will not. This then makes their livelihood, their living in India tenuous. That is essentially what people are protesting on the streets in India. The protests have been going on for several days now in many cities. And
huge, right?
It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable to see how widespread it is. You know, Mumbai in the west, Delhi and Bhopal in the center north, across the northeast of India, Calcutta, Chennai, Hyderabad. I mean, it's been many, many years since we've seen protests this widespread. And to see crackdowns on universities in the heart of New Delhi as well, these are stunning images for the world to see. It doesn't look very good, I think, for the Indian government. And it remains to be seen whether, either side will budge. On top of all of this, you have the Supreme Court, which may rule that this act is unconstitutional because it sort of ebbs away at India's secular nature, which is enshrined in the Constitution. But that could take months. We don't know when such a ruling would take place and what it would do.
And I think in 2020 there will come some important tests for India. Will the court system prove to be independent? Will India's traditional constitutionally guaranteed freedom of assembly and expression be allowed? And will this, the National Citizenship Registry, will it be proposed as a national law? But I think there's some really key questions for India, not just regarding this law, but about its very structure of a republic.
Yeah.
And what, either one of you, not to pick on the poor prognosticator of a year ago, but again, there was this idea that Modi might be a more careful leader in Modi 2.0 or his second term. And clearly that's not happened. Kashmir you haven't mentioned, but I mean, that's a whole other thing. So where does, would a Supreme Court ruling have a moderating effect? Would anything? Because I assume he's doing all these things because he sees, he feels he had a mandate of sorts to do them. He was not chastened at all because the election results were very much in his favor in the BJP's. So what's to make us feel that this may reverse in any way? Would a court ruling do that?
Well, I mean, I think, look, for now, the question is, for how long does this opposition on the streets continue?
Right.
And does that have any impact on the government's plans to move ahead, right? On top of that could come a court ruling. But I think really the question that many people are asking is, will the court prove itself to be independent?
Right.
And the thing is, what these protests are doing is they are galvanizing the opposition, they are galvanizing the country in a way that was missing 6-7 months ago when the elections came round. I mean, there are many reasons why Modi won, and it was a landslide victory, but one of the reasons was a very uninspirational opposition. And while many of us are surprised by several of the moves that Modi has put in place, including Kashmir, the NCR, the CAA that I just mentioned, the decision to move on building a Ram temple at this disputed site where a mosque was demolished in Ayodhya. The thing is, every single one of these things was widely telegraphed. It's in the BJP campaign manifesto.
Yeah.
So he is doing what he was elected to do. He is doing what he has a complete mandate to do. And I think, to Somini's point, the thing is, what we're looking at in 2020 is, what is India? What is the idea of India? Is this truly, in its bones, a secular democracy, or is it a Hindu nation? And ultimately, the people need to decide. They voted for this, and they're back on the streets.
Which is why you saw, I guess 2 nights ago, on one of the coldest nights in Delhi, a very large group of Indians gathered in front of the India Gate in Delhi, holding up the Indian Constitution and reading from it. The other big question in 2020 for India is how does the world react to these decisions by the government? You've seen a very strong statement from the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights about the latest Citizenship Act. You've seen very muted comments from the U.S. administration. I don't know how big European economies will react. I did see that there was something in Chinese state-owned media commending the Indian government for shutting down the internet, saying that, you see, it is appropriate for a sovereign government.
It's a tool we know well, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it won some plaudits from Beijing.
And I'd love to defer to you on this, actually, because it's interesting to see how much room there is to criticize India, given China. If India is taking a tough stance on Muslims, you have to look at it within the global backdrop and the Chinese backdrop of Xinjiang. And so if the response to that has been fairly muted, how much room is there to criticize
But doesn't
India?
we're probably spending too much time on India now, but it's very interesting. Doesn't India get so much currency on the global stage for A, being a democratic nation that does not, by the way, shut down the internet at a moment's notice all over the place, and B, not discriminate? You know what I mean? I mean, the Chinese, I guess, there's sort of, it's not fair maybe, but there's an understanding that that's a Chinese approach.
There's been a real contrast, though, between the way the U.S. administration has reacted to China's repression of Muslims, to the Uyghurs, and the way it's very muted response to India.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was going to make a point. It's about India, but it's also a broader story that, one of the things I've been thinking about for Asia 2020 is, it's very much on my mind from the seat that I'm in, the unbelievable discontent, and in some countries like Chile, really surprising discontent that we've seen hit some of the biggest markets in Latin America over the past few months. And I'm wondering, what are the commonalities, what are the similar threads, what are the differences that we see across Asia today relative to these markets in Latin America that are going through these periods of turmoil? And India is an interesting example, right? Because one thing that we didn't talk about in this conversation about India is that 2 months ago, the Modi government shocked financial markets with this massive and unexpected corporate tax cut. And it was taken as a sign, and local equity market I think was up like 10% overnight on this news, and it was taken as a sign that the government may be looking more favorably on using fiscal stimulus as a tool to address the concerns, Ravi, you laid out at the beginning here about slower economic growth. And it is a common thread throughout the region that fiscal space among many Asian governments is much more than it is in Latin America today. A lot of the protests we see in Latin America right now are actually because governments are being forced into austerity measures that emergent middle classes are not satisfied with, right? So Asia's in a much different point in this curve, which I think is a very interesting kind of broader point to think about when we look at the outlook for the region in 2020, that there are these governments that have, much more capacity to respond to the pressures that they're facing and address some of the risks to growth.
So let's leave India if we can. We may come back, who knows? And by the way, get your predictions and your questions ready, right? They'll be more interesting than mine for sure. But come back to climate just for at least a moment. And the activism may be heartening, and particularly among young people. But in terms of your point that it's such a big year coming up, and we have the COP conference, I think, in November. We have a U.S. presidential election that may have a big impact on some of the pledges made in other countries around the world. Back to the anxiety hope thing in terms of the issue itself, however much activism there is. Where are you on that, and what should we, the rest of us who don't follow this as closely as you do, be watching for in terms of trend points or things in the year ahead?
Yeah, so 2020 is really, really important for a couple of reasons. It's 5 years since the Paris Agreement. That was signed in November 2015. And that was kind of regarded as a real high moment,
Yep.
in international cooperation. All the countries of the world agreed to it and said, yes, we pledge to basically get global warming under control, to keep average global temperatures from rising well below 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels, and sort of in so doing, stave off the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. And the Paris Agreement asks countries around the world to make their own pledges, to rein in their own emissions, and set their own targets and set their own timetables, right? And countries did that. But even if every country around the world today were to meet its own targets, that would fall far short of that goal.
Because the forecasts have gotten worse, right?
No, because the targets that they set for themselves do not bring down total global emissions sufficiently to keep temperatures to well below 2 degrees. So there's high expectation that 5 years later, in 2020, countries would come and revise their targets, particularly big economies, big emitters would say, okay, here are our new targets. We're going to do better. So all eyes are on 2020. What are the biggest countries going to come forward with? There's a very important summit between China and the European Union. The European Union has promised very recently to ratchet down its emissions to net zero by 2050. It's hoping that by so doing, by so promising, it will nudge China to up its targets. In 2020, the next global climate negotiations, the COP as it's known, the Conference of Parties, that starts in November, just after the US election. A lot of people around the world are watching what the US election results are going to be, because not only will that determine whether the US comes back into the Paris Agreement, but also what signal that sends to the next most important country, which is China.
Right. And I would, on a point on China, and I do think the story in terms of climate policies for China in 2020 is likely to be characterized by the decisions that the government makes about how to manage slower economic growth, right? And I think it's very clear that if the relationship with the U.S. continues to deteriorate and the pressures on China's economic growth become more severe, I would expect to see that the government stepping up stimulus in a more significant way. And all of the outcomes of that would be really contrary to anything that they're trying to achieve in terms of improvement on the climate side. It's not that the longer-term goals don't go away, but that in the year of 2020, the decisions that are made are, I think, far more likely to be contrary to the climate change aspirations than supportive of them.
And when you think about climate change in Asia, two things to keep in mind, especially on India, but also on key countries of Southeast Asia, also Bangladesh and Pakistan. Across South Asia and much of Southeast Asia, climate change is already having really grave impact and stands to have much more acute impact, particularly on its poor. It stands to exacerbate existing economic inequalities. And the second thing to keep in mind is coal, which is the dirtiest fuel, fossil fuel, is slowly kind of tapering off in the rest of the world, except in Asia, where it continues to grow, though at a slower pace than before. What China does with its own coal plants at home, what China does to promote or not promote coal along the Belt and Road Initiative, very, very important to watch in the year ahead. What India does, India has set out some very ambitious renewable energy targets, but it is not slowing down on coal. To the contrary, it is importing coal from various places, including Australia and Russia, apparently in the coming years. So watch where coal goes
Right.
next year in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese are cutting back, even if they do cut back on their own consumption of coal, they're producing it and selling it to a lot of the other countries.
Financing the build-out of it.
Financing the
other
build-out of
countries.
it.
Yeah.
I mean, the only
So-
silver lining to slower growth
Yeah, that's
is
what we need, a
slowed
silver lining.
consumption.
Right. Okay. I was going to wait for this, but you've led right to it in a way, which is the American election, which of course is not an Asian story. Probably, though, it's anything could happen, but I have to imagine that the election here will be one of the biggest things that happens in 2020. And so, first of all, outcome and then implication of it. Why don't we just go down the line here? This is not an Asian thing at all. Who's the Democratic nominee? Nick?
Biden.
Biden as well. There's a reason why his ratings haven't dropped below, I think, like the mid-20s.
Okay.
Everyone else goes up and down, up and down. He stayed there, so I think it's likely he'll
Are you
win.
going to make it unanimous?
Totally beyond my pay grade.
This is not a pay grade
You're
issue.
the smartest one.
Wow. Okay.
Not going there.
All right. Who is it? Oh, well, let's then get to the meat of this. Is Trump going to win? You're not going there either?
Folly to read the tea leaves.
Of course, this is all about folly.
Of U.S. elections, because so many things could happen between now and next November.
True.
But I can only say that the implications are just, profound.
We'll get to implications in a moment. Yes.
The polls suggest that were Biden to be the nominee, he would defeat Trump.
Very carefully said. Yes.
Trump is going to win, I think. I think, to me, the biggest story for U.S. politics over the past month is that the market-implied probability of a recession in the U.S. fell from something like 35 or 38% in August to 24% today. Projections for what the U.S. economy is going to look like.
Good job numbers and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of it is this assumption that, the trade war is going to be put on, in terms of tariff escalation anyways, is going to be put on ice for next year, and the clarity that is surrounding that right now. But then also just think momentum, the job number last month, U.S. unemployment hit 3.5%.
Right.
It's the lowest since, I think, 1969. So, in that context, I think it's a tough call. I'm not saying it's a lock for Trump. His approval ratings are higher than his national average in critical swing states. His disapproval ratings in critical swing states are lower than his national averages. The economic story is brightening. So I would think those variables all favor a re-election. Incumbent advantage is also huge.
Right.
So
let's get to implications, and we've already covered in a way, and this is just obvious because platforms are out there and you can read them, that on a climate issue, there you just know that it's totally black and white, right? It just couldn't be more different. On other issues, and why don't we go to China then? We speak often here at events that there is a bipartisan distaste for kind of all things China at the moment. I'm exaggerating a little bit. So what difference, I'll pick on you, Nick, for this, what difference will it make if there's a Democrat in the White House a year or a little over a year from now on that front?
Yeah, I would say the biggest single difference is that, one of the things in my mind that's incredibly unique about Trump in terms of China policy is that he has almost nothing that he wants from China. There's no shared interest that he perceives. We were talking a lot about climate change, right? If you get like a President Warren, certainly, or even a President Biden, I think there's going to be these areas where there's a strong perception that, collaboration, cooperation with China around a certain subset of issues needs to be achieved, and that can only be achieved by having positive dynamics in other areas and facets of the relationship. And so I do think, yes, it's true that there's a emergent bipartisan consensus behind hardline China policies, and yes, it's also true that none of the leading Democrat candidates other than Pete Buttigieg have really been explicit in saying that they're willing to walk the tariffs that Trump put in place back. So all that's the case, but I still think this concept, this idea, this focus on shared interests is likely to be a bigger feature of anybody who gets it on the Dem side.
I want to go a little bit more micro than that, because it's one thing at the presidential level, but a few layers below that, what's become so clear in the last 2 or 3 years, that there's just been so much flux. at very senior levels in Washington, D.C., but also at the mid-tier levels, at the State Department, at the Pentagon, and so many ambassadorial positions around the world that have gone unfilled. And when they do get filled, they get filled by amateurs who have donated to this president as opposed to professionals, which is a change. So all of those things, I think, will take a much longer time to change than Election Day on November the 8th. And that worries me. It worries me in terms of U.S. engagement around the world and building trust over time.
Okay. To the U.S.-China relationship, whoever is in charge then. I mean, we've covered trade a little bit, but any thoughts on assuming this mini deal gets done, whatever it is and the contours of it? There's a giant swath of things that, well, you probably all worry about and know about, but it's your bread and butter, Nick. Are we going to have something more comprehensive that maybe gets into the tech and national security issues? Huawei, any other thoughts on all of that?
My views were quite unlikely to see a phase two before the election in 2020. I think for reasons on both sides. I think in the U.S., I sort of mentioned earlier, I think, in the environment of improving economic outlook, markets in the U.S. hitting all-time highs, we've seen a clear pattern that Trump, in periods where he's feeling enabled by markets and, by the economic outlook, he is incentivized to take not a softer but a harder line.
Right.
Toward China. And there's a clear sort of trend line that's held up over the past few years in that regard. Also, it was a critical, harder line policies toward China were a critical part of his 2016 campaign message. I think that's going to be very similar in 2020. So that's the U.S. side. And then on the China side, I think the key, and it's arguably the bigger point, which is that there doesn't seem to be real interest in pursuing the kinds of fundamental economic reforms that are at the center of the asks, right? The existential sets of concerns that drive this harder line reorientation in China policy. So I don't think the Chinese government really, under President Xi, is particularly interested in pursuing those reforms in many areas, as work that you all do here at the Asia Society that I'm familiar with has shown. And to that extent, I think it's hard to be optimistic.
Well, and to the back to just a China or a U.S.-China centric version of the opening question, anxiety and keep you up at night. Are there hopeful areas that you might see or might advise? Let's say you were a diplomat tasked with somehow building some bridges at the moment, and climate used to be pre-Trump a great, a great element to help. For a moment. Right. Where is some common ground that maybe we're not thinking about right now? Because we're very aware of all the areas where the bridges are getting ruptured. Do you see any?
I mean, I think the best thing we could hope for is that the two sides could find some way to sort of agree to disagree on the critical, sensitive national security, industries where you have heavy involvement from Chinese state-owned companies, and then maybe can agree to a shared understanding of this broader area of economic interactions and even social cultural interactions that don't need to be completely, completely unsettled, completely abandoned in the context of trying to address these other concerning areas in the relationship. So is it really necessary for, retail and consumer goods companies that are doing business in the China market today to be subject to, a tense period of a period of tension in the relationships? Is it really necessary for any kind of efforts on the U.S. government's part to curtail the very positive flow of Chinese students into U.S. Academic institutions that create so much of a benefit for those institutions in the ecosystem here in the U.S. as well? Yeah. So those would be the kinds of things that I would think about. Like, what can we identify that these things we agree that we're not going to agree in all these areas, but in these areas we think the interactions should continue.
So why don't we, before we come to questions and other predictions from the audience, just try to do a quick round of some sort of hot zones across different parts of Asia. And one is a segue in a way, because North Korea, oddly or perhaps not oddly, is a place where we have thought over the years the United States and China might find common cause to deal with this very tough problem. We have a deadline, what is today, the 18th, so 13, 14 days from now, when Kim Jong-un has said, if I don't see something in the vein of a nice new proposition from Washington, fill in the blank, something is going to be hell to pay.
Christmas gift.
Christmas gift. Is that what he's called it?
I think so.
Really? Oh, dear. Ravi, or anybody, North Korea 2020. I mean, this is, talk about folly probably here in terms of predicting, but what do you see?
Well, I mean, just going back to Singapore and that sort of fated meeting between these two leaders, if you look back at sort of the path that they went down of using personality as a way to sort of bridge the differences between the two, I think what's very clear is that that approach completely failed. I can't imagine really seeing much change on that front in 2020. So I think, what'll be interesting to see is what kinds of concessions Kim is able to win from America in terms of economic sanctions or any relaxation of that. Part of this is the optimistic side of me, but I think deep down, Kim is probably more rational than we think he is, and is likely not going to do something completely crazy. But the key, I think, on the other side here and in China is to keep trying to sort of maintain the carrot and stick approach, so that even a stalemate is better than a more aggressive outcome.
You had an interesting. Well, go ahead.
I would just keep my eyes on the Olympics in Japan next year. For perhaps that's a diplomatic moment, a diplomatic breakthrough moment, either on North Korea or maybe something on U.S.-China. Yeah.
Yep. Well, I mean, the last Olympics had that. They were, of course, in Korea, but the Japanese have made very clear that they have high aspirations for these being, more than just a sporting spectacle.
Well, yeah. I mean, they tend to be platforms.
Sure.
For clever, imaginative diplomacy. Yeah. Whether we have leaders who are capable of clever, imaginative diplomacy is an open question.
Yeah. And I think on North Korea, so to me, and we, think about the backdrop headed into 2020, right? We've got a U.S. president who may have been impeached while we were sitting here right now, or is about to be impeached, right? And we're headed into what is clearly going to be a highly contentious re-election year for President Trump. A tremendous amount of inward distraction for U.S. politics, and a president running for re-election. I mean, we've never in history had an impeached president running for re-election, right? Nope. So all of this internal focus on the U.S. I think creates a maybe the word isn't vacuum, but a period of time when the incentive for governments like in Pyongyang, like in Beijing, to find ways to test U.S. resolve is heightened. Right, and where markets, because economic projections are, darkening in some way, but markets are at all-time highs, so the implied cost for governments of taking those kinds of decisions is going to be a little bit lower. Right, global liquidity is everywhere today, so that's a part of the story as well. And so I think from that perspective, North Korea to me and South China Sea as well look like areas where we need to really pay attention to the decisions that these governments may make and the calculations that they make. I think on North Korea, outside of the kinetic stuff, the potential for another nuclear test or missile launch, I'm hearing a lot of concern about cyber and asymmetric capabilities, right? We saw a lot of U.S. election interference in 2016, obviously, and I would have that on my radar as well as something that the nexus of North Korea, where their capabilities in the cyber realm are perceived to be quite high, and this difficult environment in 2020 are.
Our Vice President at the Policy Institute here, Danny Russell, this is a big concern of his, the cyber capability and the chance that they will use it in North Korea. Just a little bit of a counterweight, and it goes to some other prognosticating, whether on North Korea or Iran for that matter. You could argue that while the impeachment trial is going on or the papers are filled with that kind of news, that perhaps the president or one of his aides here says, okay, we need a big distraction right about now, and so I'm going to go reinvigorate whatever I've been thinking about doing with Kim Jong-un, particularly, by the way, if he has sent off a Christmas gift or two, right? And he wants to be seen again as I'm diffusing things and I meet him in yet another Asian capital. Now, so that's one crazy idea, or perhaps not that crazy. The other We've not talked about Iran, where, as you pointed out, that's another place where the protest movement internally got very hot, and also, of course, where the United States relationship continues to be, a huge issue for that country and for the nuclear deal writ large. There's been an idea ever since the UN General Assembly sessions in September here that Trump might decide, I want to go see that guy. A wholly different question whether he wants to see Trump. But it's a very long way of getting to, do we think Donald Trump may feel the urge or whether as a distraction or just to get one of these foreign policy wins, to seek out one of those guys and make the headlines that way.
One of the strangest things is that other leaders always wanted to meet the American president. And in the case of Iran, you have this strange scenario where the Iranian president is saying that I don't want to meet unless I have something to show for it.
Yeah.
Until we have some tangible work that was done ahead of time that we can then show our people. So the great carrot of meeting the most powerful person in the world doesn't quite work with Iran. And in a sense, that's not a bad thing, because it will eventually, I think, if the room to work with is not, there isn't that much room to work with, in that you already have a maximum pressure campaign.
Right.
Some of the sort of the warmongering crew is no longer advising Trump immediately. And the chances of a meeting are fairly limited unless real groundwork is undertaken ahead of time. So I see that more as a stalemate of an issue. But then, interestingly enough, Iran, I think, has presidential elections coming up 2021, I believe. And it'll be interesting to see whether, who wins out domestically there. Is it going to be the hardliners or more moderate voices, and how that informs their decision-making?
Okay, there's always one issue that, because it's time for your questions now, that is super important and we don't get around to, and that's Afghanistan. Just really quickly, I mean, for almost 20 years now, there's been this tug here in the United States. We can't possibly stay there any longer. On the other hand, we can't possibly leave, given the gains that have been won, and risk those. Is this finally going to be the year when the troops come home? Anything else on Afghanistan? Anybody?
Well, I mean, Esper, the defense secretary, has I think he said just a couple of days ago that they're looking at a troop drawdown in 2020. It's unclear to what degree, but we know that at least some amount of troops will be leaving. And this all comes amid the backdrop of an election that was inconclusive this year. A runoff couldn't be held in December or January because it's just too cold. And so you have a real sort of situation where there's limbo. Democracy hasn't quite provided an answer, and talks with the Taliban are just at the very outset deeply problematic. I mean, who is the Taliban really? Which faction are you speaking to? What can they really guarantee in terms of a ceasefire or peace? So it's a mess.
Oh boy. Okay. Lift us. We have microphones. Why don't we just start in the front and work our way back? Predictions are fine. Questions are fine. Combination is fine. Go ahead. Yeah, and you can just say who you are.
Hi, my name is Samira. I'm a journalist here in the city. I have two questions. One for you, Tom. When you introduced the topic of India, you mentioned that it's not fair to say that it's excluding Muslims, and I'm really curious to know sort of where that came from, because it is a ruling that explicitly leaves out one minority as opposed to others, and I'd really love to know sort of a bit more about what you said on that. And my next question is about, for 2020, what kind of accountability are we looking at when it comes to governments like India and China? Obviously, as you said, there's something in the air with the youth. They're protesting. They're out on the streets, but the leaders are still operating with a lot of impunity. Modi was here during UNGA while the Kashmir crisis unfolded, and that's still going on. And now with the Citizenship Amendment Bill, are there international allies who might be holding them accountable? I know recently Bangladeshi foreign minister canceled their trip to India, which is huge because Bangladesh is fairly friendly, the current government with India. So I'm curious to know, in terms of accountability, what does next year look like? Thank you.
Well, I'll just take my end really quickly, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. I just meant, to your point, implicit versus explicit. If you read what they actually said on the first day, and it's why I was appreciative of the explanation here, it doesn't explicitly say no. In other words, once you see the ramifications, and clearly everybody on the ground saw it right away, it explicitly does. But so accountability in China or India, that's a big question. I mean, you guys started to get at this before. In terms of what you did about what the responses may be. I don't know.
Yeah, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Look, I think you have to, you can see accountability in two ways. One is at a global level, but two is domestically. And on that front, people are protesting. And these are serious protests that are truly nationwide, as I had said earlier, and they're sustained. There will be several state-level elections coming up in 2020. It's very important for the BJP to be competitive in those elections. That will be an outlet for, I think, people to express dissatisfaction where it is. But it's important to remember as well, this is a very, very popular elected leader. He is enacting the mandate of the people. He's enacting things that were explicitly in their manifesto that people knew about and were spoken about widely on the campaign trail. And so, who are we really to sort of pass judgment on several of these things when this is what the people have voted for? So I think we really have to see how it plays out in 2020 in terms of mostly how sustained these protests are going to be and how strong civil society in a place like India can be. It's a real test for what that country is.
The first test will come with the Delhi election, and whether the BJP can take back Delhi, which I think they haven't had for quite some time.
That's right.
Right. So the first political test, I think, for the opposition and for the ruling party will be the Delhi election.
One assumes that the strength and size of these protests have taken the government by surprise, I have to imagine, right? I mean, there is, as you both said, it's deeply unusual in that country for anything, and it happened very quickly, right?
But I think the answer to that lies in whether the government will go forward with rolling out this national registration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, as Somini pointed out earlier, I think the internet shutdowns and just how tech, I think, shapes so much of discourse in that part of the world is fascinating. Yeah. The fact that India especially has taken the lead in every time there is unrest or communal violence, it shuts the internet down in that place quite locally, is its way of saying that we don't want we want to contain this. So I think the ability of citizens to not contain it up against the government's will to do so will be a very interesting tussle in 2020.
Yeah,
and connectivity has been cut for, 5 months in Kashmir, right?
And counting, yeah.
And
August 4th onwards.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and of course, one of the countries where we have not seen any, only very sparse evidence of popular protests has been China, and arguably, a strong part of the reason for that is because of the government's ability to control the domestic narrative to such a large degree. So, I would say accountability. I think we could talk about anxiety, right? It's clear that government that spends more every year on domestic information controls and security than it does on national defense is incredibly anxious about its position. But whether that presents itself in terms of actual change is a different question.
I was going to say this side of the room, but this side of the room seems to have no questions. Yes, sir.
China is certainly not the first repressive dictatorship to come into existence. But what concerns me very much is the technology that is developing and becoming available in terms of repressing the population. And it's not just a matter of shutting off the internet, it's also tracking people by DNA, fingerprints, eyes, facial recognition. It seems like Orwell's vision of 1984 may actually come into being in China. And that knocks out any possibility, I think, of change, reform, or moderation. And I'd just like to hear your opinion.
It's a prediction, too, I guess.
It's a prediction, yeah.
A story worth reading in the New York Times is precisely on this subject today. It's about China's surveillance economy. And again, it's something to watch. Like, can they stitch together all these different technologies, in such a way in the coming months to sort of take it to the next level? Because, mind you, we also have many of the same technologies. We have all the same technologies in place in this country.
Yeah. Well, I think I've said what I think about that issue, but I think I will say that that underpins part of my thinking about the U.S.-China story in 2020 is that it's that exact trend line of the trajectory of domestic policy and politics within China versus what the rest of the world, and not just in Washington but in other capitals in Europe and advanced economies around the world want to see China headed. That is at a fundamental impasse and a widening gulf, right? So I think that's why, whether or not we get a trade agreement with China right now is really sort of a much smaller story in this bigger discussion about a complete divergence between systems.
Real quick, Frank Brown, trustee at Asia Society. 6 months ago, I would have hoped that a different prediction about the U.S. election would happen, but I have to say I think I agree with Nick at the end of the day, but it's going to be an interesting period of time. On the hopeful side, I'm an investor, work for an investment firm, and one of the positives we've seen in China is the amazing development of their healthcare system, both infrastructure, drug discovery. It's phenomenal from a pretty much standing start in a relatively short period of time. The question is, how is it going to be used? How is it going to be shared? There's huge needs in the region, et cetera. But that's one positive that I've seen.
Interesting.
Great. Yes, sir. Gentleman, and then the woman behind.
I think we all can predict that next year, or certainly coming soon, is going to be a catastrophe on the Earth with global warming. I mean, we put 45 billion tons of carbon in the air every year. How about the scientific community in Asia, especially in China and India? Are they talking about the impact on the monsoons, the glacier melting, and the collapsing river systems?
Yes, I mean, in short, yes. I think scientific institutions, certainly in India, and to some degree in China, I can only access the things that are published in English. But yes, I think the melting of the glaciers is hugely important to water supply for all of East Asia, all of China, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Water, I think, is something to really watch in 2020.
And 2021 and 22.
Yes, absolutely. But I think water stress can impact all kinds of other things.
Sure.
It can lead to civil unrest. It can lead to competition between groups. In India, it poses a particularly acute challenge. Not enough water in many places, way too much water in some places, polluted water in other places, salinity along the coast, impacting agriculture. So we did a story a couple of weeks ago dealing with this in India, India's water crisis. I invite you all to look at it. So I do think that is sort of a cross-cutting issue and a source of great concern.
So this may be a naive or just neophyte question about climate and politics. It was interesting some years back to see that as the quality of the air, which is of course not the only manifestation, was so bad in China, it clearly got the government there to pay attention, because that's not something you can sweep under the rug. It's what you're seeing and breathing and all the rest. And all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, the Chinese were making big grand plans for solar and wind power and all the rest, and Xi Jinping was going to Davos and saying, we're going to be the leaders in this.
Close down coal-fired power plants near the cities for this reason.
Now that it seems that India, sadly, has taken the mantle of the place with the worst air on the planet. And of course, it's an utterly different political system. Does that, does the negative there help perhaps drive greater, that the government's going to need to be more active on the environmental front, if not, those sorts of things you're talking
Certainly, I've seen the incumbent in Delhi in these elections talking about air pollution in political ads. But I have to say, air pollution or water pollution, or lack of water, has not figured as a major national political issue at all. Not yet.
Yeah, the imperative is still growth, and anything that challenges growth, I think, is something that is a much longer-term consideration and not anywhere near as urgent as it should be.
Boy, I promised, a woman in white, yeah.
So my question is similar to climate and more of the broader ESG realm. It seems that a lot of corporations are interested in trying to help in the ESG realm, especially looking at supply chains in Asia. But a big inhibitor right now is how to quantify what is ESG and what is ESG compliant. So my question is really, what do you think is perhaps the path forward in that in order to help corporations really take more of a greater role in that?
You can explain what ESG is.
Yeah, I'm going to punt on that. I don't have a prescription for, what corporations can do. I will only say that to reduce emissions, it's pretty clear what needs to be done. It's to pivot away from the use of fossil fuels for energy, for transportation, for industry, and to replace those with non-fossil fuel sources. For much of the emissions reductions that are necessary, for much of it, we don't need unicorn technology. The technology does exist. And one thing to watch in the coming years, starting in 2020, is, two things, like how quickly coal will start going down, particularly in Asia, how quickly offshore wind will ramp up, and then what will happen to electric vehicles, EV penetration. China is sort of really leading the pack in some ways on that, including with electric buses. It's selling a lot of electric buses to other countries, particularly in Latin America right now. But all of the gains that have been made so far with electric vehicles have been offset by the popularity of SUVs. Of all new car sales last year, something like 40% was SUVs. So for all the progress that's been made on electric vehicles, SUVs are kind of tipping the scale.
Interesting. This seems to be the row with all the questions. Why don't we work our way down? Yes, sir, in green.
Thank you. When you're a prognosticator, you work with variables and constants. Not to say that there are many constants in this world, but I think one certainly prior to the election of this president in 2016 was the U.S. could be counted on to call out countries, whether problematic or not, on certain human rights violations. Mm-hmm. One thing I'm sort of shocked we haven't talked about today is what's going on in Myanmar, what's going on in Xinjiang, sort of the human rights implications even of Hong Kong. I'm wondering if, moving forward, you think that materially the U.S. has left behind human rights. It seemed that Trump almost had to be dragged by the Congress to even say anything about Xinjiang. I'm wondering, moving forward, maybe not even thinking about a year, but a decade, since this marks also the turn of a decade, will human rights be a part of U.S.-Asia relationship, U.S.-China, insert country here?
Great question, and maybe I can just add one little thing for whoever wants to take it. Is that an example where, a different president just because that, as a policy, you could technically shift on a dime, or have we just changed our paradigm?
You want to start?
Sure. Thanks for putting me on the spot, you two. I think, so if you have a Democratic president, I would imagine a bit of a shift on that front. And I think, one of the very interesting things about this presidential campaign so far is that we haven't really discussed foreign policy at great length in terms of, how do you define what a new democratic foreign policy would look like? And I imagine that debate will begin in 2020 to some extent. But a leftist foreign policy would almost necessarily have to take a more activist approach toward human rights globally. So I imagine that may become part of a discussion. To your point of about Hong Kong or Myanmar or Xinjiang or Kashmir, voices were raised by Democratic senators mostly. So it's not like that sort of moral standing or sense is dead, but yes, it has taken a backseat, and 2020 will be very interesting to see how that moves the needle on that.
Yeah. Well, Ravi, I agree with everything you said, and I commit to taking the first crack at the next question if it's in my so,
too many passes to Ravi.
But I did want to make a comment on that, though, that I think I think about there's kind of two different facets to this. There's, what U.S. policy will be and how, the realities of the U.S. domestic political system are reflected in foreign policy, which I think, I agree with Ravi that, a change in administration could very quickly bring about a change in the prioritization of human rights vis-a-vis other issues in terms of the foreign policy focus. But then I think the secondary question is U.S. engagement in the world, and if that foreign policy messaging, no matter what it is actually going to be delivered in a meaningful way. And that, to me, is the area where I actually think there's a bigger structural trend line toward much more of an inward focus for the United States that's going to be with us not just for this next administration, but in the time frame you described of at least the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because the problems that we're experiencing domestically are severe enough that they're going to require that inward attention. And you've got a polity now that is demanding that inward focus and attention from the U.S. government. And I don't think any of those things change with the election. If anything, I think they're actually strengthened by a campaign that is ultimately going to come down to, even as if I said, Biden gets the nomination, clearly the pressures, toward populism from his leftward flank are going to influence his ultimate orientation, and that domestic focus is going to be invigorated even further.
And does that then mean, as a natural outcome, that the next president or the one 4 years later, whoever it is, might be very active in the human rights area, but because American influence in Asia or wherever else has been eroded a certain amount, it may just not pack the wallop that it once did?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yes, sir. A couple more.
Sure. Thank you. Earl Carr, representing Momentum Advisors, as well as New York University, and thanks, Tom, for organizing such an exceptional panel. I wanted to push back a little bit, Nick, on your notion that the strength of the U.S. economy kind of plays into a victory for Trump in the elections. I highly agree that the broad fundamentals of the U.S. economy right now are very strong. But, we have seen currently an inverted yield curve in the economy, which has predicted the last 7 recessions.
But uninverted now, right?
Uninverted, yes.
No, it was inverted, and now it's uninverted.
Yes.
Yeah.
We also see negative interest rates within Europe as well as in Japan. And China's been very strategic on how it has placed tariffs, particularly impacting farmers within the Midwest, and that really strikes to the heart of Trump's base. So my question is, if we can't get a deal on the trade front, how does that impact Trump in the elections?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, the cheap talking point I use on this is that Kansas is not going to vote for a Democrat, right? That, it's absolutely true that the agricultural, the rural base has been adversely affected by Trump's China trade policies, but it's also true that I don't think, those constituencies, to me, the bigger question is less about U.S. agriculture and more about the Rust Belt and the U.S. manufacturing and industrial base in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. And there, I do think, we have some indications that there has been, some pain felt as a result of the trade war in ways that's not able to be offset by subsidies from the U.S. government like they've been able to do with the agriculture sector. So, that's clearly a negative in the Trump. If you're keeping a tally of, does he win, does he lose, that in my mind, is clearly a negative, but only to a small degree. I mean, again, unemployment in every swing state that matters. Actually, here's a trivia question. Do you know how many swing states today have higher unemployment than they did when Trump was elected? 0. Not a single state has higher unemployment. Do you know how many has the same unemployment? 1. Colorado. You know what it is? 2.7%. So this is not a president who has paid a serious economic cost for these trade policies with China in any way, I don't think. So yes, it's in my sense, it's a bit of a negative, but I think overall it's not likely to unseat this much broader trend line of the U.S. economy has had a really great couple years.
So the beauty of those predictions is, Earl, either you or Nick are going to be right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it'll be recorded.
And how appropriate, by the way, that we take one more question, and it's from Manik Mehta, who I think has to be you may win a prize, Manik, for the medal for most frequent attendee of all Asia Society programs.
I'm very pleased to know that.
Yeah, I don't know what the prize is, but you get the last question.
Okay, I missed any discussion on the ASEAN region, Southeast Asia.
Guilty.
Yes. There is an Islamic summit going on in Kuala Lumpur right now, and many say that this is a kind of a breakaway from the OIC. How do you see that? And how will it impact politics in Asia?
I knew I said I would take the question, but I don't even know what the OIC is. What's the OIC?
The Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have no view on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know Southeast Asia well enough to answer that question. I'm sorry.
There you go. Pass to Ravi again.
Yeah, this is the problem when you have a really global remit. You know nothing deeply and a tiny bit about everything. I also don't have a very strong take or sense on this, but it's been a very interesting year, this year at least, for countries with majority Muslim populations. In that, how do they unite and coalesce around issues? When Imran Khan and Mahathir met at the UN along with Erdogan, they promised to create a BBC for Muslim countries. And yet, we all know that Imran Khan can never criticize China over Xinjiang. So there's this real tension between all of these countries in terms of how much they want to mobilize around Islam, how much they want to cater to their domestic populations, but how much of that is tied to foreign interests and trade. And I think we'll see that continue to play out in 2020 in terms of which issues they pick on. Will they speak out more on Xinjiang? Will Kashmir really be the rallying cry for them in the region? It's a fascinating issue.
This, by the way, is not an answer to your question, but just a note about ASEAN. So I believe next year, which now Mahathir is taking his third, so he's his third year of what was meant to be a 2-year term at age 92. So he's turning either 94 or 95 next year. And on longevity politically, Hun Sen takes the mantle, I think, of the longest-serving leader in the region at his 35th year in power in Cambodia. Before we wrap tonight, just 2 quick points. One is, since it is the last event, as I've said many times tonight, I do want to embarrass and do a shout out for Tenzin Topton, who you've taken a seat, Tenzin. That's very rare for you, and John Wong, our 2 staffers who run almost all these events. Kudos to you guys. And there still are some beverages in the back. I thank you all again, and huge thanks to our panel for joining us and being brave. Thank you.
And this was all off the record.
Yeah, right.